At 0615 hours on August 21, 1942, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was positioned at the edge of a coconut grove on Guadalcanal, looking across a shallow stream toward the American defensive positions he was preparing to assault. Behind him, 917 elite Japanese soldiers waited. These were men with years of rigorous training, men who had achieved victories throughout Asia without suffering defeat. They believed, just as Ichiki did, that no Western military could withstand their advance. Across that stream, facing them, were United States Marines. Ichiki had reviewed intelligence on these adversaries before setting out. He was familiar with Japanese assessments regarding the Marines. They were supposedly soft, without discipline, and lacked the fighting spirit revered by the Japanese. According to this view, they would collapse as soon as confronted by a forceful attack. In the next 6 hours, 800 of Ichiki's troops would lose their lives, and Japanese notions regarding the combat abilities of American forces would begin to unravel. This account reveals how Guadalcanal destroyed a particularly dangerous assumption in military thinking: the Japanese command's conviction that American Marines could not fight effectively. To comprehend what transpired on Guadalcanal, it is necessary to understand what Japanese military leadership thought about Americans prior to the outbreak of war. For many years, their doctrine relied on the concept of Yamato Damashi, or the spirit of Japan. This transcended mere nationalist feeling and served as a core belief that Japanese warriors possessed a spiritual edge that could outweigh any technological or material shortfall. As Western states depended on machines and firepower, Japan leaned on the unbreakable resolve of its combatants. The foundation of this ideology stretched back to the oldest Japanese myths, recorded in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, which described the population as descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. The emperor himself was considered divine, a direct link to the celestial. Japanese troops did not fight just for their homeland. They fought on behalf of a holy lineage extending back millennia. This set of ideas formed the backbone of Japanese military thought as the 20th century began. Japan's landmark victory over Russia in 1905 seemed to validate these beliefs. A less industrialized Asian nation had toppled a European power due to its superior military spirit. The Russian forces, better equipped and supported by industry, suffered defeat at the hands of Japanese soldiers who showed an apparently unmatched willingness to sacrifice their lives. The conclusion drawn was unmistakable. Physical resources were meaningless when confronted by soldiers ready to give everything for their emperor. The Russo-Japanese War became the archetype for Japan's future conflict strategies. They believed spirit would win over material advantage. By the 1930s, this faith was codified into official doctrine. Officers were taught that Western warriors, in particular Americans, possessed weak spirits. These opponents came from self-indulgent, material cultures that prioritized comfort over self-sacrifice. According to this thinking, they could not be expected to hold out when times turned desperate. They would capitulate or retreat. The early victories of the Pacific War appeared to bolster this assessment. Japanese attacks on the Philippines in December 1941 led to the swift defeat of American and Filipino defenders. Strongholds that were estimated to endure for months surrendered in just days. The battles of Bataan and Corregidor became symbols, not of American resistance, but of American defeat. Tens of thousands of prisoners were taken in what ranked as one of the gravest disasters for U.S. forces. At Singapore, dubbed by Winston Churchill the gravest British military catastrophe, over 80,000 Allied soldiers gave themselves up to a Japanese force only half their size. British military leaders considered Singapore unbeatable, but Japanese troops disproved that in only a few weeks. Under General Tomoyuki Yamashita, Japanese forces pushed rapidly down the Malay Peninsula using tactics and speed that consistently outmatched defenders. In other campaigns such as the Dutch East Indies, Hong Kong, and Burma, the sequence repeated. Colonial militaries, which had maintained peace for years, gave way rapidly before Japanese units renowned for their willingness to die. At Wake Island, A small contingent of Americans resisted for more than 2 weeks despite daunting odds before surrendering. Japanese officers observed this but did not reinterpret their overall conclusions. They regarded Wake as an exception. Its garrison simply had no means of escape. Consequently, the Japanese command maintained its previous opinions about Americans. They possessed more advanced equipment, plentiful supplies, and larger fleets, but, in Japanese eyes, they lacked the key attribute: true willingness to fight. This belief took specific root regarding the U.S. Marine Corps. Japanese analysts assessed the Marines as unimpressive, a minor force, under-equipped when compared to the Army, and with little serious combat experience. Since World War I, the Marines had faced no major adversary. According to reports at Imperial General Headquarters, the Marines were considered little more than garrison soldiers pretending at warfare. In 1942, the Marine Corps numbered fewer than 70,000 at the war's start. During the interwar years, it had operated mainly in lesser-known conflicts in Central America and the Caribbean. Engagements in Nicaragua and Haiti were not regarded as significant by Japanese strategists. From this record, they saw no signs the Marines would present a serious challenge. What they failed to perceive was the change that had occurred in the Corps during the 1930s. Marine leaders had crafted new amphibious doctrines, anticipating that confrontations in the Pacific would demand assaults on fortified shores. This led to special equipment development and the creation of unique training programs. Practically, they had established a force built for the kind of contests about to take place. More vital still, they cultivated a culture placing high value on individual initiative, leadership at the smallest scales, and the capacity of low-ranking Marines to keep operating even if communication systems went down and plans unraveled. This aspect would prove crucial on Guadalcanal. Colonel Ichiki's own beliefs matched those widely held by Japanese officers about American troops. Japanese analyses typically described U.S. Marines as lacking in masculinity and courage, missing the fighting spirit esteemed by the Japanese. When he received his orders to reclaim Guadalcanal taken by American forces earlier in August 1942, he saw an opportunity to demonstrate his unit's prowess, not a formidable challenge. The Americans had taken control of an airfield under construction by the Japanese, and needed to be pushed back into the ocean. Ichiki's command was to wait for the remainder of his regiment before engaging, but he considered that unnecessary. The first group of 900 was, in his mind, sufficient against the Americans. What else could possibly be needed? Major General Alexander Vandegrift was unfamiliar with how the Japanese perceived his Marines. He was primarily occupied with keeping his troops alive. Vandegrift, aged 54, had fought previously in Nicaragua, Haiti, and China. He spent his adult life as a Marine. He was well aware of the capabilities of his command but also recognized that nothing in their experience matched what awaited in the Solomon Islands. He had been assured 6 months of preparation before committing to battle but instead received only 3 weeks after Operation Watchtower the Guadalcanal invasion was ordered. His Marines were scattered throughout the Pacific, their supplies still en route from New Zealand. Proper advance planning was absent. Intelligence regarding Japanese fortifications was inadequate, and the only practice landing carried out on Fiji was, in Vandegrift's later opinion, a total failure. The exercise was so poorly conducted that one officer later stated, more experienced logistical specialists would almost certainly have labeled the entire Guadalcanal campaign as unworkable. The 1st Marine Division was a mix of battle-tested veterans and newly enlisted men. Many had only joined after Pearl Harbor, driven by outrage over Japan's actions. Their training had been brief, and very few had battlefield experience. They were unfamiliar with jungle combat and the diseases common in such environments. They had not faced an enemy committed to dying rather than surrendering. On August 7, 1942, 11,000 Marines landed on Guadalcanal, as well as on Tulagi and Florida Islands nearby. They achieved total surprise. The defense, comprised mainly of Japanese construction laborers and a small Korean security force, retreated into the forest when American naval artillery commenced shelling their posts. By the end of August 8, the Marine force had secured its goal, the unfinished airfield soon to be named Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot who perished during the Battle of Midway. The initial occupation had presented less resistance than anticipated. However, the Marines quickly discovered that holding Guadalcanal would not be as straightforward as capturing it. A sudden reversal soon occurred. Between the nights of August 8 and 9, Japanese warships surprised Allied naval forces at the Battle of Savo Island, inflicting a severe defeat. 4 Allied cruisers were sunk, resulting in the deaths of more than 1,000 sailors, one of the gravest naval losses in U.S. history. The fleet's commander, Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, worried about risking his aircraft carriers, decided to withdraw the ships, thereby removing most of the Marines' remaining supplies and equipment yet to be unloaded. The sense of abandonment among the Marines was palpable. Veterans would recall this event with resentment decades afterward. One unofficial medal struck after the confrontation depicted an admiral's hand dropping a hot potato for a Marine to catch, bearing the motto "Facat Georgius," or "Let George do it." Vandegrift's Marines found themselves isolated. They had accomplished their immediate goal but now confronted the challenge of holding it with scant ammunition, limited rations, and no naval support. With half their materials still on retreating ships, they had no significant equipment or reinforcements available. They were stranded on an island that Japanese troops were already preparing to recapture. The Marines set up a defensive ring around Henderson Field and labored tirelessly to complete the airfield using what Japanese tools and supplies they could salvage. Japanese rice stores became their main food source. They dug defenses into the volcanic ground and braced for the inevitable Japanese response. The surrounding jungle proved a far worse foe than they had expected. The oppressive tropical heat and stifling humidity were constant. Mosquitoes carrying malaria infested the area. Within weeks, illness incapacitated more Marines than enemy gunfire, but the perimeter held and work on the airfield continued. The first U.S. aircraft landed at Henderson Field on August 20. These planes, later known collectively as the Cactus Air Force, a nod to Guadalcanal's Allied codename, became critical for defense, though they were not yet deployed when the Japanese launched their initial counterattack. The wait was not long. Colonel Ichiki and his force of 917 men came ashore at Teivu Point on the night of August 19. Japanese scouting flights had detected only a handful of enemy troops and no major ships in proximity. A high-ranking staff member from Rabaul flew a reconnaissance mission over Marine lines on August 12 and observed little, concluding that U.S. forces had withdrawn most of their strength. Imperial headquarters was convinced the Marines had left Guadalcanal, leaving behind a thin garrison. Ichiki had been told he might face no more than 2,000 troops. The truth was, 11,000 Marines were positioned on Guadalcanal. Ichiki did not know this, and it is uncertain that this knowledge would have affected his actions, given his confidence in his troops' qualities. His regiment, the 28th Infantry, had originally been tasked with invading Midway Island until the outcome of the naval battle precluded this. It was then redirected to Guadalcanal instead. These were soldiers who had undergone preparation for the toughest type of mission, specifically, an amphibious assault on entrenched defensive positions. They represented some of the finest troops Japan possessed. Ichiki kept 125 soldiers behind as a rear guard and promptly started advancing toward Henderson Field with his remaining contingent. His instructions were to wait at the landing area for the rest of his regiment, which would arrive aboard slower transports within several days. He chose to disregard these directives. He believed the Marines would crumble with the initial attack. In his estimation, there was no necessity to await backup. Delaying would merely allow others to partake in accolades he considered exclusively earned by his own men. Unbeknownst to Ichiki, the Marines knew of his imminent approach. A coast watcher by the name of Jacob Vouza, formerly a sergeant major in the British Solomon Islands police force, had been intercepted by Japanese troops while conducting reconnaissance. The Japanese discovered an American flag hidden inside his loincloth and demanded he divulge the location of Marine units. Vouza refused to cooperate. The Japanese forces bound him to a tree and subjected him to bayonet drills. He was stabbed 7 times across his arms, neck, shoulder, face, chest, and abdomen. Despite these wounds, he survived. Once the Japanese departed, Vouza gnawed through his restraints and navigated through the forest for miles, bleeding from his multiple injuries. He managed to reach Marine positions, delivering a warning about the incoming attack only moments prior to Ichiki's offensive. Vouza would recover from his injuries and remain on duty with the Marines for the duration of the campaign. Eventually, he received the Silver Star and was designated an honorary sergeant major in the United States Marine Corps. Around 0130 hours on August 21, Ichiki commenced his attack over the sandbar at the mouth of Alligator Creek, referred to by Americans as the Tenaru River, an inaccurate label on their maps. The Marines lay ready. The opening wave of Japanese infantry raced over the sandbar, shouting "Banzai," bayonets affixed, convinced that the Americans would retreat in fear. Historically, this tactic had been successful. This was the expected result. The sequence of events that followed astounded the Japanese survivors. The Marines stood their ground. They offered neither capitulation nor panic in the midst of a fierce nighttime assault. Rather, they maintained their positions, delivering concentrated gunfire into the advancing Japanese lines. Machine gun teams positioned along the creek unleashed precise barrages. Marines, having drilled extensively with their water-cooled .30 caliber machine guns, tore through the assault waves. Japanese troops were struck down in scores, escalating to hundreds. The sandbar transformed into a scene of mass carnage. Ichiki had confidently anticipated that American resistance would crumble in the face of a Japanese charge with bayonets and battle shouts. This had always worked previously. Western forces, in his view, could not endure the mental strain of a banzai assault. He assumed they would lose composure and withdraw. The Marines, however, did not retreat. Artillery placements, with targets already set prior to nightfall, rained shells directly onto the Japanese advance. The accuracy of American gunnery stunned the surviving Japanese command. Every possible approach appeared covered. Every push was repelled with systematic fire. When Japanese infantry reached the American defenses, they met equally fierce resistance in close quarters. Marines engaged with firearms, sidearms, bayonets, and even unarmed combat. They gave up ground reluctantly, only to launch counter-offensives and reclaim their checkpoints. Courage remained firm, and mercy was neither asked for nor shown. One Marine machine gunner, Private Al Schmid, suffered wounds at the battle's early stages when a grenade detonated near his machine gun. Flying metal struck his face, rendering him blind in both eyes. In spite of this, he continued to fire his weapon by touch, guided by his assistant gunner who aimed his fire by identifying approaching Japanese by sound. Schmid held his position through the night. By daylight, the Japanese assault had been utterly repelled. Ichiki's forces had gained nothing except heavy losses. The engagement, however, was not concluded. At sunrise, Vandegrift ordered a counteroffensive. Marines from 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, forded the creek from upstream and circled to envelop the surviving Japanese. Light armor supported the advance. M3 Stuart light tanks, known to the Marines as their iron cavalry, moved in. The encirclement was executed with efficiency and remorselessness. Japanese survivors found themselves hemmed into a coconut grove with Marines steadily approaching. A few attempted to escape by swimming and were gunned down in the water. Some continued to fight until exhausting their ammunition, after which they charged with bayonets. Others took their own lives instead of surrendering. Tanks moved through the grove, guns blazing, crushing injured Japanese under their tracks. Following Marines displayed the same lack of compassion that Japanese forces had previously shown throughout Asia. American media would later present a cleaner version, but the factual events were merciless. The Marines had endured Japanese tactics and replied with forceful brutality. A Marine who fought in the battle later portrayed the aftermath, stating that corpses were clustered or piled near the gun emplacements on the sandbar, as if dying not as individuals but as groups. Moving between the dead were those collecting souvenirs, proceeding carefully as if wary of concealed explosives. By 1700 hours on August 21, the Tenaru's battle had reached its end. Of Ichiki's force of 917, some 800 lost their lives. An estimated 128 evaded capture and eventually regrouped at Teivu Point. Marine casualties counted 35 killed and 75 wounded. The ratio was immense. For each American casualty, Japanese forces suffered over 7 dead. This result was entirely unexpected by Japanese planning. Colonel Ichiki set his regimental flag ablaze to keep it from enemy hands, an immense dishonor in Japanese tradition. He then either perished fighting in the battle's climax or committed ritual suicide soon after. Accounts are inconsistent, and the specifics remain unknown. What remains uncontested is that Ichiki did not survive to justify the calamity of his failed mission. When news of Ichiki's detachment's destruction arrived in Rabaul, Japanese command reacted incredulously. The initial reports must have contained errors. It seemed implausible that an entire Japanese infantry regiment was wiped out by U.S. Marines. Such an event was impossible in their estimation. The Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo mirrored these reactions. The occurrence was deemed so improbable that many officers refused to accept the reality. The prevailing assumption was that something had gone awry with Ichiki's tactics. Perhaps he had attacked an incorrect position. Perhaps unexpected geographical obstacles had impeded the attack. Perhaps the stated losses were exaggerated. In their minds, Marine effectiveness was not in doubt. Some Japanese officers later admitted to frustration with this continuing attitude of denial. The high command in Tokyo persisted in downplaying the American threat on Guadalcanal, convinced that once a sufficient Japanese landing occurred, the Marines would capitulate. This continued underestimation would have disastrous effects. This self-deception proved lethal. Instead of reconsidering their assessment of American resolve and skill, Japanese leadership concluded that simply not enough men had been deployed with Ichiki. The resolution was straightforward. Send additional troops. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was given command over the forthcoming effort to reclaim Henderson Field. He would lead a contingent of about 6,000 soldiers from the 35th Infantry Brigade, a seasoned group that had previously fought in Borneo and the Philippines. Kawaguchi's own reputation was that of an innovator, unafraid to challenge directives and make adjustments as needed. His subordinates respected him. He was known for his unusual concern for the well-being of his units. This new force was expected to succeed where Ichiki had not. Kawaguchi's field experience and willingness to improvise were seen as key to overcoming any Marine advantages. Kawaguchi was more analytic compared to Ichiki. He closely reviewed the Tenaru battle accounts. He understood that Marine defenses were stronger than initial estimates suggested. He recognized that a head-on night attack across open ground would be suicidal. Yet Kawaguchi believed that a surprise nocturnal offensive from a less anticipated approach could secure victory. His plan demonstrated considerable sophistication. Instead of striking along the obvious routes well fortified by Marines, Kawaguchi would maneuver his force through jungle terrain and attack from the south, taking advantage of thinner defenses. A ridge sloping toward Henderson Field offered a natural line of advance. Capturing the ridge in a surprise night action would enable his men to break through and seize the airfield before the Marines could mount an effective defense. This ridge was nameless in September 1942. After the coming conflict, it would be known as Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge, earning a place in Marine Corps history. Kawaguchi arrived on Guadalcanal late in August and early September, his forces transported by destroyers and barges that risked American air sorties. The jungle march proved to be significantly tougher than Kawaguchi had foreseen. His troops contended with conditions that seemed tailor-made to fragment a military force. Paths vanished, streams impeded movement, and impenetrable plants made organizational unity almost unattainable. Units were separated from one another. Vital supplies were depleted. Men reached attacking positions physically spent, hungry, and scattered. Certain battalions became so disoriented in the brush that they missed their attack points altogether. Barges carrying heavy weaponry were detected and destroyed by American planes, leaving Kawaguchi's group without artillery. Despite these serious issues, Kawaguchi retained confidence in success. He held to the conviction that Japanese warrior spirit would conquer any difficulty. He reassured his officers that the Marines would yield once his attack achieved a breakthrough. He predicted the Americans would be unable to withstand ferocious close-range combat. Kawaguchi foresaw morale superiority as the deciding factor. The assault began the evening of September 12, 1942. The ridge was defended by approximately 800 Marines, primarily from the 1st Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson. These Marines represented some of the most rigorously prepared men in the Corps, accomplished in close combat and irregular tactics, with previous action at Tulagi and in patrols near Guadalcanal. Edson himself was a distinguished commander. He had led Marines in fighting in Nicaragua during the Sandino Rebellion and built a name as one of the boldest leaders in the Marine Corps. His distinctive red hair earned him the nickname Red Mike. His troops held him in a mix of reverence and caution. They understood he demanded nothing of them he would not do in person. Edson skillfully arranged his men along the ridge, covering all likely approaches with pre-targeted artillery. He suspected a major attack was imminent. Japanese bombing runs had recently targeted the ridge, indicating its likely value as an objective. He ordered his Marines to dig in deeply and brace for a serious assault. Japanese attackers advanced in multiple waves, shouting their battle cries as they assaulted Marine lines with intense dedication. The jungle was consumed by gunfire. Flares lit up the attackers, transforming the nighttime landscape into a chaotic tableau of muzzle flashes and illuminated smoke. Even then, the Marines held firm. The struggle on Bloody Ridge was some of the fiercest seen during the entire war. Japanese soldiers broke into Marine lines on several occasions. At one moment, they neared Henderson Field by just a few hundred yards. The final result was in doubt for a prolonged period. Marines fell back to their last defensive positions. Should those final positions be breached, the airfield would be lost. Nevertheless, the Marines did not yield. Edson personally motivated his troops during the pivotal moments. He moved up and down the line, exposed to fire, overseeing counterattacks and refusing to concede ground. When some Marines started retreating under relentless attack, Edson exposed himself in the open and gave commands. He reminded them, "The ridge, this is the ridge. Hold it." Artillery, guided by forward observers, wreaked havoc on incoming Japanese attackers. The bombardment was deadly accurate, breaking up each Japanese thrust before a critical mass could be reached. The link between the infantry units holding the ridge and the artillery positions behind them was essential for survival. As ammunition supplies dwindled, Marines resorted to using bayonets and their rifles as clubs. Close quarters fighting erupted all along the ridge, with Japanese attackers who broke through being pursued and eliminated. The darkness echoed with exploding grenades, rifle shots, and cries of the injured. On the second night, Japanese troops advanced so near to Henderson Field that the grounded aircraft were visible to them. American aircrews began readying themselves to destroy the planes rather than allow their capture. All that the Marines had defended appeared close to collapse. Subsequently, the Japanese offensive lost momentum. The mix of steadfast Marine defense, support from artillery, and complete exhaustion forced Kawaguchi's attack to a standstill. His troops had exhausted every option. Their efforts did not suffice. By the dawn of September 14, Kawaguchi's offensive had been thwarted. The ridge and surrounding jungle were now covered with over 600 dead Japanese troops. Many hundreds more suffered wounds. Those who survived fell back into the jungle, with many already famished, beginning an agonizing westward withdrawal that would result in hundreds more fatalities from disease, starvation, and fatigue. Afterward, General Vandegrift reflected that Kawaguchi's assault was the only time in the entire campaign he doubted the outcome. He later confessed that if the Japanese had penetrated the defenses, we would have been in a pretty bad condition. Historian Richard B. Frank would later note that September 1942 on the ridge south of the vital airstrip later known as Bloody Ridge marked the closest point to Japanese victory on the island itself. Again, the Marines withstood the attack and this time against a Japanese force tailored to defeat them. The setbacks suffered by Ichiki and Kawaguchi ought to have prompted a deep re-evaluation of Japanese strategic beliefs. Yet this did not occur. Instead, Japanese military leaders escalated their commitment to Guadalcanal while disregarding what the recent battles demonstrated about U.S. combat strength. At the heart of the issue was institutional culture. Within the Japanese army, frank discussion of defeat was discouraged. Any officer admitting to faulty plans faced possible disgrace. Blaming juniors, attributing setbacks to bad luck, or unusual factors was often preferred over admitting that core strategies might be misguided. Thus, instead of recognizing the true capabilities of the U.S. Marines, Japanese commanders argued that only additional troops, shipping, and material were needed. They believed the concepts were correct, the failure lay only in execution. They anticipated that this next attempt would avoid previous errors. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, head of the 17th Army, arrived on Guadalcanal as of October 9 to take direct command of the upcoming attack. Among the reinforcements he brought was the Sendai Division, regarded as one of the most prestigious units in the Imperial Japanese Army. The Sendai had seen action in both Manchuria and China, emerging from campaigns that reinforced Japanese confidence in their superiority over other Asian militaries. Confidence ran high that they would do the same against American forces. This new effort would be full-scale. There would be a coordinated attack involving more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers intended to at last overpower the American defense. Several simultaneous assaults were planned to hit from multiple angles. Naval gunfire would bombard Henderson Field beforehand, and air attacks aimed to neutralize American planes. Hyakutake's optimism was such that his staff developed detailed plans for the American surrender ceremony, intending it to become the standard for all Japanese units to envy. All believed the Marine defense would be eliminated. They set the decisive offensive for October 23, 1942. Hyakutake sent a dispatch to his superiors brimming with assurance. Now was the moment for Japan's fateful battle against the United States. He was indeed correct about the significance but not about the outcome. The fight for Henderson Field, also referred to as the October Offensive, began on the night of October 23, 1942. Hyakutake unleashed multi-directional attacks, aiming for a breakthrough by sheer numbers alone. Initial assaults targeted the Matanakaw River region at the western edge of the marine perimeter. Between 9 and 10 Japanese tanks advanced thunderously in the darkness, their motors signaling their approach before they could be seen. U.S. Marines equipped with 37mm anti-tank guns waited until the vehicles closed in, then opened fire. Each tank was methodically destroyed. Infantry moving behind the armor were mowed down by machine gun fire. But the Sendai's primary attack struck from the south, where success would decide the battle. At that section of the front, Sergeant John Basilone, assigned to the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, directed 2 heavy machine gun units. Famous as Manila John for his prior Army service in the Philippines before enlisting with the Marines, Basilone was 25, born in Buffalo, New York, and raised in Raritan, New Jersey, the 6th of 10 siblings in an Italian-American household. Military training during his Army years honed his skills, earning him a reputation as one of the best .30 caliber machine gunners in the Corps. On the night of October 24 to 25, his position came under attack by approximately 3,000 men of the Sendai Division. The Japanese suffered appalling losses. Basilone battled without any rest, food, or sleep for over a day. Once his unit's ammunition was depleted, He navigated through Japanese-controlled ground to resupply, lugging 90 pounds of ammunition and arms over 200 yards exposed to hostile fire. Following the deaths or injuries of his gun teams, he personally took over the machine guns. Whenever the guns jammed from excessive heat, he fixed them under fire, scorching his hands on the overheated barrels. In one instance, so many enemy casualties amassed before his position that they obstructed the gun's line of sight, forcing Marines to leave cover and move the bodies. Private First Class Nash Phillips, who lost one hand in the engagement, later recalled Basilone stopping by the medical tent. Barefoot, with bloodshot eyes, soot-covered face, shirt sleeves rolled up, and a .45 pistol tucked into his waistband. He simply wanted to see how we were doing, Phillips stated, adding that Basilone would forever be unforgettable. By the arrival of reinforcements, only Basilone and 2 other Marines from his section were still present. The area outside their position was strewn with Japanese corpses. Basilone would be awarded the Medal of Honor, the first enlisted Marine in World War II to be so honored. Comparable scenes unfolded along the Marine line that night. Elsewhere, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller led the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Puller eventually became the most highly decorated U.S. Marine, but during this ordeal, he was one of many struggling to keep his men alive against overwhelming odds, and his battalion maintained its ground. Others did as well. The synchronized Japanese attack, once considered likely to break through, was stopped by the Marines' unyielding defense, just as had happened before against Ichiki and Kawaguchi. Following the fight, Puller questioned a Japanese captive, asking why their tactics remained unchanged despite failures to breach the defense, or why efforts were not shifted elsewhere. The prisoner's answer illuminated the Japanese command mentality. "It is not our custom," he said. The plan had already been made. To change it was unthinkable. It had to unfold as set. This rigid adherence to plans, coupled with the consistent underestimation of the Marines, sealed Japan's fate. The Army did not reward lower-level initiative. Officers risked disgrace by deviating from instructions. Soldiers suggesting alternatives were contravening the established chain of authority. In contrast, American Marines valued adaptability. Officers were trained to modify tactics as needed, and if one effort failed, they switched to another. This innovation, alongside the resolute tenacity of individual Marines, developed a defensive network that the Japanese could not overwhelm, irrespective of numerical superiority. The October assault ended in a complete defeat. Japanese losses totaled between 2,200 and 3,000 dead. By contrast, U.S. casualties were under 300 killed and wounded. This lopsided exchange was ruinous. The elite Sendai Division was devastated. Only now did Japanese leaders begin to seriously consider that Guadalcanal might be impossible to recapture. Their committed troops, spent materiel, and sacrificed lives had achieved nothing. Henderson Field and its airpower remained under Marine control. The perimeter was still secure. As 1942 came to an end, Guadalcanal's situation had been transformed. What Japanese strategists thought would be retaken in a matter of days had come to be known among their troops as Starvation Island, a place men went to die, not from combat, but from malnutrition, illness, and despondency. The Tokyo Express, the nightly destroyer runs designated for ships and supplies, could no longer deliver what was needed to sustain Japanese forces. With American planes at Henderson Field, slow transport vessels risked destruction in daylight, leaving only fast warships to make risky nighttime supply runs down the slot. Even so, essential supplies fell short. Drums and bags of food meant for the garrison often floated away in the ocean before hungry soldiers could claim them. Attacks by American bombers sank numerous resupply vessels, and PT boats continually challenged the Tokyo Express's efforts. Each night, fewer provisions reached those ashore. Desperate Japanese troops began to survive on roots, weeds, and tree bark. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and numerous other tropical diseases spread, which their medical teams were ill-equipped to handle. Warriors, once strong, became gaunt, barely capable of basic movement. They used a grim rule of thumb. Those able to stand had about 30 days left, those able to sit 20, those who had to urinate lying down only 3. A man unable to speak had 2 days, and one who could no longer blink would not survive until morning. They could do little but watch as American planes soared from the very airfield they could never seize. They saw U.S. vessels arriving with supplies for the Marines as their own side starved. Sounds of U.S. artillery, bombers, and machine guns underscored the false hopes their commanders had given them. The psychological blow extended beyond those dying on Guadalcanal. It was a shattering moment across the Imperial military. For the first time in the Pacific Campaign, U.S. forces had fought the Japanese to a virtual standstill. The illusion of invincible Japanese might had, for the first time, begun to crumble. By December, General Hyakutake was desperate. On December 23, he cabled Tokyo with a bleak summary. Supplies have run out, and patrols can no longer be sent. We are incapable of holding out any longer. The 17th Army requests permission to launch a final attack and die with honor, rather than starve to death in our own defenses. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet, wrote to Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa that the peril on Guadalcanal Island was dire. He compared it, even unfavorably, to the challenge faced during the Russo-Japanese War, referencing Port Arthur and the approach of the Baltic Fleet. This was a remarkable historical comparison. The blockade of Port Arthur during 1904 and 1905 stood as one of the most challenging and bloodiest operations in the history of Japanese armed conflict. Yamamoto's comparison of Guadalcanal to that costly ordeal made clear just how thoroughly this campaign had surpassed every prior expectation. The Japanese ultimately pulled their forces out of Guadalcanal in the early days of February 1943. Codenamed Operation K, this withdrawal became one of the war's most effective evacuation efforts. Across 3 separate nights, Japanese destroyers clandestinely removed around 10,600 troops who had survived, doing so right in front of the American units. Behind them, they abandoned upwards of 14,000 fallen in battle and roughly 9,000 more who died from illness and lack of food. For each American soldier lost on Guadalcanal, the Japanese suffered the deaths of almost 10 men. The survivors who managed to escape bore lasting scars, with many afflicted by ailments from which they would never fully recover. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, whose attempts at Edson's Ridge had failed, personally witnessed the way in which the campaign devoured the Empire's premier units. He possessed a deeper understanding than most of the consequences these losses had for Japan's prospects in the Pacific. His statements were not mere overstatement. Guadalcanal had severely depleted several of Japan's elite formations. The Sendai Division, the Ichiki Regiment, and the Kawaguchi Brigade had each been decimated in assaults on the marine lines. The aviators and aircraft crews lost amid the skies over Guadalcanal could not be replaced. The vessels sunk near the island during engagements such as Savo Island, Eastern Solomons, Cape Esperance, and the naval battle of Guadalcanal marked a catastrophic drain on Japanese naval strength that could not be replenished. Yet, the gravest loss was intangible. It amounted to the shattering of confidence. On Guadalcanal, Marines refuted convictions long held by